Ever missed a sign? It's one of my boys' favorite stories to tell on their sister. She was finishing up her freshman year, I think it was, and a friend of hers who wasn't going to the same school but was close by partnered up with her to get a ride home from school. You know, students do that. And they were on their way home. Both of them had been working very hard, late night studying and so forth, could hardly stay awake, both very, very tired, excited to get home as quickly as possible. And in order to keep each other alert and engaged, you know, they were just just yapping, just talking 90 miles to nothing. And Courtney looked down at her watch and she thought, you know, we ought to be about 20 minutes from home. And she looked around and nothing but wheat fields. And she said, this doesn't look like where we ought to be. And the girl that was driving the car, and she says, well, what do you mean? We're 20 minutes from home. And Courtney said, I'm not sure. She checked her GPS. No blue line. That's not good. And then she zoomed out from the little blinking blue dots. And you know what I'm talking about? Little blink on the GPS. And they were not 30 minutes away from home. They were 3.5 hours from home in the middle of Kansas. And Courtney broke the news to her friend. And her friend said, Courtney, I think I'm going to cry. And so they pulled over. Courtney had to drive the rest of the way back home. She just couldn't deal with it anymore. You ever miss a sign? It can be really costly. And those are just, you know, traffic signs. There are other signs, you know, like the signs between a husband and wife. Those can be really costly. You know, part of good husbanding is good decoding, fellas. You know what I mean? You have to know what the look means. You have to translate the sigh, right? Or you can get in trouble fast. Max Lucado tells a story of, it was a few weeks after their honeymoon. They had moved back home. He had invited this guest speaker to come, and he wasn't just any guest speaker like a buddy from seminary. This was one of the distinguished professors that he had sat under and a specialist in marriage and family therapy. How would you like to invite one of those people into your home, right? So he invites this person, and he caught the first sign. As he explained who was coming that weekend to speak, his wife just gave him a look, and the look meant, we got to clean the apartment, right? Just that's all it took. And the second sign was a nonverbal sign as well. It was his wife, Denlyn, on the kitchen floor, scrubbing the kitchen floor. Well, being the sharp young husband that he was, he recognized these signs and got off his duff from the couch and decided to help. He saw a couple of packages and boxes, you know, from the wedding still over in the corner. He decided he'd put those away, you know. But being a guy, the second box caught his eye. And the box was one of those big framed collage picture things for the wall. So while his wife continued to clean the house, he decided, well, you know, vacuuming's not that fun. Dusting is not his thing. So he's going to assemble the collage picture. And as she cleaned the house, he took all of the photos of their courtship and marriage and so forth, spread them out on the bedroom floor, and started picking the best ones. He knew his wife would appreciate it if he picked the best ones for the frame and started putting. He missed the next sign. It was when she came in the room and said, "What are you doing?" To which he answered, "Oh, I'm just picking out the best pictures." Right? So he continues to put the frame together. Did I tell you there was a matching frame? He works all afternoon into the evening. Finally, his wife has single-handedly cleaned and put everything together in the apartment by herself. She comes in and she announces, you know, he's missed the size, missed all the hints. She comes in and announces, "Honey, I'm very upset with you right now. I can't even talk about it. We'll talk about it in the morning." Now, if any of you guys are out there going, what? What? Just talk to your wife right now. She ever missed a sign? It can be costly. right? But those are just signs that come and go through life. But the sign I want us to talk about today, if you see it for what it was, I think can change your life. Let's read about it in John chapter 19. And I'm going to start reading with, just to put it in context, verse 16. And so Pilate delivered Jesus up to them to be crucified. And they took Jesus, therefore, and he went out, bearing his own cross, to the place called the place of the skull, which is called in Hebrew Golgotha. There they crucified him, and with him 2 other men, one on either side, and Jesus in between. And Pilate wrote an inscription also, and put it on the cross. And it was written, Jesus the Nazarene, the King of the Jews. Therefore this inscription many of the Jews read. For the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Hebrew, in Latin, and in Greek, Jesus the Nazarene, the King of the Jews. And verse 21, and so the chief priests of the Jews were saying to Pilate, helps if you don't turn 2 pages, saying to Pilate, write, or do not write, the King of the Jews, but that he said, I am the King of the Jews. Pilate answered, what I have written, I have written. Interesting. The sign that hung over Jesus' cross was this sign that hangs from this cross this morning, basically, this kind of sign. And it was written in 3 different languages. The Greek, Jesus o Nazareos, Basilios ton Judeon. Jesus of Nazareth, of Basilios, King, ton Judeon, the Jews, right? Or it was written here in Latin, here in Hebrew. The same phrase written 3 different times. We can misread a lot of signs, but if the Jews or anyone there had really understood what was written on that cross, I wondered if they might have ended up someplace other than in Kansas. Don't miss the sign on the cross. Let's make sure we decode it this morning. First of all, it was Pilate's sign. It was Pilate's sign. He was the one that had it written. And in those days, when a criminal was sentenced to a crucifixion, most of them were insurrectionists. They were the kind of criminals that the government wanted to make an example of. Not only shame them, but warn everyone else. This is not what you want to do, right? And so it was meant not only to shame the criminal, but to intimidate those who saw it. And 4 soldiers would be on each flank of the criminals as they walked bearing their own crossbeams towards their place of execution. It's self-shameful. And as they would walk up in front of them, one of the guards, one of those 4 Roman guards would bear the sign. The sign that bore the sentence for why this person was about to be crucified. They wanted everybody to know. See, it was a matter of shaming and of warning. And so Jesus' sign, that was his crime, according to Pilate. That's an interesting, I don't think anyone had ever had that kind of sign before. Interesting that he wrote that about Jesus. It was meant to shame the criminal. It was meant to warn society. It was also, Barclay says, a last chance. The sentence would go before them on the way to their execution, and if by chance someone took opposition to that or would appeal the sentence, the person had a last chance to avoid the cross, according to William Barclay. And it's interesting that no one along the way said anything. Now, that was not unusual. You would probably be taking your own life into your own hands if you were to break up an execution procession, especially if your opposition was found to be invalid in any way. But it's interesting, on his way to the cross, perhaps as other criminals, Jesus could have been spoken up for, but that didn't happen. Even Pilate, who himself said, "This man has done no wrong," didn't have the strength to stand up for Christ when it really counted, when the intimidation factor of the priests were being put upon Pilate, and he is no friend of Caesar who does not crucify a man who claims to be the king, right? And Pilate, not wanting to be at odds with Caesar, thinking his own head might roll if that was discovered the case, his political future would be very much in doubt, decided to go ahead and give Jesus over to the crowd to be crucified. So for a fellow who didn't seem to have any backbone before, and now all of a sudden he stands up and he's resistant. What I have written, I have written. Why did he respond that way? Why did the Jewish priests take opposition to what was on the sign? Well, they said, don't label him the King of the Jews. Say that was just his claim. It was the outrageousness of the claim that got him crucified. And Pilate, it seems almost to get back at the Jews, says, "Live with it. What I've written, I've written." Why was it written that way? Was it just the duty of the court to do that? Was it contempt for the Jews? Some have wondered if Pilate wrote what he wrote because it was a confession. And there are some traditions that say that Pilate and his wife later on became Christians. You remember when Jesus was being held in custody, Pilate's wife had dreams about Jesus, and she said, "Have nothing to do with this man," right? So God was already working on Pilate's wife, we know. And some people think that tradition is probably true because there's a conversation that we know about that we couldn't know about unless Pilate had told it. And that was the private conversation that Jesus had with Pilate about what is truth. What is veritas? Pilate asked. What is really truth? Right? Do you remember that? And so how would we know that conversation if Jesus never talked about it again? And it would have had to have been someone who was privy to that conversation. Many people think it was Pilate himself, years later after he became a Christian, shared his experience of what happened on the way to the cross. That may be true. But at this point, it's highly doubtful that Pilate is coming out confessing as a Christian already. So it's probably not his confession. But if the statement is to be taken seriously, maybe it wasn't Pilate that was writing this sign at all. Maybe it was God. Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. And if it was God's sign and God's message to the world, in fact, John 5:11 and 12 says that this is God's testimony. That he has given unto the world eternal life, and that life is in his Son. He who has the Son has the life. He who does not have the Son does not have the life. And almost 3 or 4 times in that passage, it talks about that being God's testimony. And if you reject it, you're calling God a liar. This was God's testimony of who this man was. Not a criminal, but your king, right? And if this is God's message to the world, to recognize who his Son is as their Savior, as their Lord, as our salvation, then maybe this sign is not just a matter of function for the purposes and the processes of the cross. Maybe this sign is a sign of God's passion for the world. That as his Son died for anyone who would receive it, he did not want them to miss the sign. He wanted them to decode the significance of what was happening in that moment. And it's interesting to me that if that be the case, if God, it says in 2 Peter 3, 9, says that he wishes that none should perish, but all come to repentance. If that's God's heart, and that's God's heart for the whole world, he wrote it in every language that could be far read at that time, in Hebrew, in Latin, and in Greek. And when that sign was written in Hebrew, God was speaking the language of religion. The Jews had brought us the religion of the one true God. And when it was spoken in Greek, it was speaking the language of the culture of the day, of philosophy and art. He didn't want any of those people left out. And if it was speaking through, what was the last, Latin, then it was the language of power, the language of government, the language of those that were in control. God then, through this sign, was pointing the whole world to his Son. And if it was God's sign, then how do we decode it? Well, I think this sign tells us at least two things about God. One is that God can work through anyone. And number two is that God can speak any language. God can work through anyone, and God can speak any language. God, do you realize that if this is true, then really the first evangelist from the cross was Pilate. If you look in Luke chapter 23, it tells the story of the criminals that hung on each side of Jesus, right? And as they hung there, one mocked him only, but the other one turned from his mocking to realize the situation of his own soul and to reach out to Jesus. And you remember what he said? Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Now, we've heard it so many times, we could almost finish the sentence, right? Of course that's what he said. But what a weird thing to say to a guy dying on a cross. You ever thought about that? Why not say, hey, Jesus, if you are who you say you are, how about easing our suffering? Jesus, if you are who you say you are, why don't you take us down from this cross? Jesus, if you are who you say who you are, why don't you curse all these who are accusing us and treating us so badly? You know, those would be the kind of things that I would expect an average Joe to say, wouldn't you? But he turns to this guy dying on a cross and he says, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. What would make anybody think that a guy on a cross like that, bleeding his last, was a king? I bet it wasn't a crown of thorns around his head. I bet it was the sign that hung just over his head. Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. And something about that rang true with, with the thief on the cross. And he turned to Jesus and he cried out, and Jesus said to him, surely today you will be with me in paradise. Can you imagine what that was like? When the thief got to the pearly gates, what kind of exchange would have been had there? I read this in a book this week and thought this was hilarious. The angel says, have a seat. Now tell me, Mr. Thief, how did you come to be saved? Thief, I just asked Jesus to remember me in his kingdom. Sure didn't expect it to happen so quickly. Angel, I see. And just how did you know he was a king? Well, there was a sign over his head, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. I believed the sign, and here I am. Believed a sign, the angel writes. That's right. The sign was put there by some guy. I think the guy named John. Angel, no, I don't think it was John. The thief, maybe it was that other fellow, Peter. No, wasn't Peter, said the angel. Thief, then which apostle did it? Angel, well, if you really want to know, The sign was Pilate's idea. No kidding. Pilate, huh? Don't be surprised. God used a bush to call Moses and a donkey to convict a prophet. God used a big fish to turn Jonah around. There's no person that God won't use. Well, that about wraps it up. Take this to the next window. Just follow the signs. He believed the sign. He believed the sign, and that was all it took. Jesus took care of the rest. He entrusted himself completely to Jesus, and Jesus took care of it. Pilate was perhaps the first of the evangelists. If so, I don't know how we could explain the turning of the thief to Christ and to salvation. God can use anybody. Even people that don't even know that they're being used. T.D. Weldon was a scholar and a fellow at Oxford back around the turn of the century, 1920s, 1930s, around in there. And he was kind of the father of the cynical professors. And that almost rules academia today. He was the first who stated as his philosophy that when students came, his first focus point, the first thing that he wanted to get done was to completely shatter any beliefs that they brought with them. Totally tear them down. And then once they developed this new radicalized theory of the world, then he attacked that theory. So that at the end, they were completely bewildered and only clever. And folks, that's still the state of academia today. That's just my side comment. But what was amazing about Weldon was one interaction he had with a fellow professor at Oxford. One day as they were talking with one another, both of them agnostics, both of them cynics, but this one not quite the same level of cynic that was Weldon. Weldon set the standard. In fact, this man later said that Weldon believed that he had seen through it all and that he was at the bottom of everything, right? Total cynic in heart. And one day, this cynic, T.D. Weldon, was having a conversation with this other professor, and he had this comment, and the comment was basically this: rubbish, the dying God. So someone had written an apology about the Gospels and defended the Gospels there on campus. And they had read it together, and this was Weldon's take on it. Oh, what a bunch of rubbish. The dying God. It's almost as if it could be so. And this other agnostic professor thought either he's drunk or I just heard something I never thought I would hear. Does he see something about the Gospels and the cross that could be possibly credible? And it's so set in the craw of this other professor that he started digging into Christianity himself. Until later on, he would say that he was drugged by the force of his own intellect and the evidence that he examined to faith in Jesus Christ. One of his plays will be playing here in the city soon. The Screw Tape Letters. Do you recognize how C.S. Lewis came to Jesus? God used T.D. Weldon. Now this is my point. If God can use donkeys, and if God can use pilots, and if God can use T.D. Weldons, you don't think he can use you? You know, how is it that we disqualify ourselves as we don't know enough, or we wouldn't be convincing enough? It's amazing to me how often we want for the qualified person to show up to share Christ. And find the pastor. And then maybe the pastor thinks, well, maybe I can find my old professor. You know, we keep passing that buck, and God, rather, would have any of us become
a sign to point someone else to his Son, if God used a crooked politician to lead a thief to Jesus, and if he used a cynic to lead a scholar to Christ, why couldn't he use you and me? I think he can. I think he wants to. And I think he's already set us up to be successful. Because God not only can work through anyone, God can speak any language. And I'm not just talking about, languages like you learn in school, French and Spanish and all that kind of stuff. But languages are that, aren't they? They are something that holds a people together. And when languages are different, it actually becomes a barrier that keeps people apart. Right? This next week or so, when we do the Journey of the Cross, Lene's offered to actually translate the guide that's now in English into Spanish, so that those who only speak Spanish in our community can come and experience that encounter with Christ and say, well, isn't that going to be cool? Missiologists actually say that language is one of those barriers that keep cultures resistant to the gospel. Because until the gospel is known in their own heart language, it's hard to be trusted or found reliable. But missiologists have also seen that once the gospel gets planted in a new people group, that it spreads like wildfire. And so one of the biggest barriers and one of the biggest secrets to being effective in sharing the gospel is to recognize what language you speak and what language can you speak. How can you put this in someone else's language? Now, I'm not talking about French and Spanish and German. I'm talking about language that connects you to other people. Some of you speak fishing. That language connects you to somebody else. There's a whole group of people that you see eye to eye with, and within 2 or 3 sentences into a conversation, you could tell, because they speak the language, you fish. Are you with me? Or maybe it's sports. Or maybe it's raising kids. This last week I got asked to come and do a TV show interview, which is pretty cool for me. I never get asked to do stuff like that. But I was a little nervous because they didn't tell me what I was supposed to be interviewed about. So I went over there, and turned out the person who set it up hadn't informed, they didn't know what they were going to interview me about. So I thought, this is really weird. And so I had to come up with so you want to talk about this? And they said, yeah, that'd be good. I was going to talk about the unity services that we're having here in Broken Arrow and how God's blessing that, and we agreed to that, and that was going to be the focus of the topic, and they turned, the little red light came on the TV, and they turned and they looked at the little red light, and the lady said, we're here with a famous person today. And I'm thinking, who came in behind me, right? And the other guy that was her co-host thought, you could see his eyebrows, you could read the signs. What? And he said, well, at least his dad's a famous person. And she said, yeah. And so I'm thinking, how am I going to get to Broken Arrow Unity services out of this, right? And I'm almost in a complete panic, still wondering, God, why did you even set this up? This makes no sense to me whatsoever. And just before the interview started, the little technical lady came over and she said, here, put this microphone pack in your pocket and we'll just hide it in there. Well, I had stuff in my pocket. I always have stuff in my pocket. So I took my stuff out, my wallet and other things. I gave them to her and she disappeared back into the darkness with that stuff, right? And so after the interview, they do 5 or 6 of these in an afternoon, I came to understand. And there's other people waiting in the green room for their opportunity. So once our little interview is over, and it seemed to go pretty good, and I went back into the green room. And once I got in the green room, I said hello to a few people. I started for the door, and I realized no wallet, no keys, right? But I can't go back in there because now they're taping the next show, see? So now I'm stuck. And I'm thinking, I've got time for this afternoon. God, what was all this about? And I sit down, stuck in the green room with a family that had come that was going to share their story about how their kids had been completely rocked by Jesus on a mission trip and now had turned their lives completely around. And this was a blended family that has just come together. I didn't know all this, but when I sat down and we started watching their kids on the teleprompter, all of a sudden it just opened up this conversation. And their son was on there, and he was, I think, a freshman in high school or something like that. And the host asked him a question, and as she asked him a question, this was his response. And his brothers and sisters were still out there in the green room with me. And so they just busted out laughing. I mean, this was the kid in their family that never was for a loss of words. And all of a sudden, when that little red light came on, he checked out. I mean, he was off in la-la land. Couldn't think of anything. And she just kept asking him questions. The sister kept helping him out. And then finally she said, well, what was the most challenging thing that you experienced on this mission trip? And finally some words came to mind. He kind of blinked and he said, the second day I had really bad diarrhea. So I guess the family felt like they had no more secrets, to keep from me. And they just started opening up about their challenges as a family and what it was to blend it and problems with exes and how to make finances work and the financial challenges that they were under and what it meant to raise kids. And I spoke their language. I'm on my second marriage. I'm raising teenage kids. Do you understand? And for just a moment, we spoke each other's languages, and there was resonance in that room. And I just bowed my head, and having heard all that, I just took all of that to the Lord, and we prayed together, and it was a holy moment. The Spirit came in such a way that I think there was healing even in that moment as we prayed. And then I knew that's why I came here. Right? And you'll have those experiences all this week, the next few weeks. You have them every week, but sometimes you miss the signs. Sometimes you just think, well, this is an interesting conversation. And it is, because you're speaking the language. But I wonder if that person that speaks the language that you speak know the Christ that you know. Because if you speak their language, you can be a sign in their language that points them to Jesus. Right? We can't afford to miss those signs. There's heaven and hell. Eternity often hangs in how we can plant a seed in those times that we're speaking the same language. God not only can work through anyone, God can speak any language. And so I ask you this, if he can speak any language because he's trying to reach every person, because he's trying to reach every person, he speaks any language. And I'm amazed sometimes at the languages God uses to reach every person. It's downright scandalous. It's as scandalous as a king hanging as a criminal. The way God, because of his passionate love for each and every person in this world, will go to all lengths to find some messenger to get his message to a person who can read it and recognize it because it's being spoken in their language. I want to share a little video with you today, and I want to forewarn you. This guy is in a band that you won't see at many Christian concerts. It's a band that's called Korn. K-O backwards R-N. The band Korn, okay? And they're not called Korn because they're corny. I don't really know why they're called Korn, but this is one, let me just say this. If I was to play just 2 or 3 measures of their music, most of you would instantly think, that's satanic. You know, this is not just heavy metal. This is what they called hair metal. It's radical stuff. And it connects with people, and especially young people, because so much of the music identifies with anguish and with pain and with difficulty, right? And so it speaks their language. They get it. And no matter what it sounds like, they hear another heart resonating with their deep struggle. And many of them are going through great struggles, incredible stuff for which, if they had a fully developed frontal cortex, it would still be hard to deal with. And those things don't come around till you're 25, which explains a lot of me before it ain't. But you understand what I'm saying? Unless someone speaks their language. Now, this guy used to be the lead voice for the band Korn. Let me tell you, since that time, he has become a born-again, authentic Christian. But what is amazing to me is what he's doing now. Listen to his story. And what fascinates me about that fascinates me. And I did a little more research, and I found some footage on what he's actually doing at his concerts. He'll gather those who want to, invites them to a time off stage after the concert or before the concert, and he shares his story about how God has radically changed his life. He tells them about Jesus and tells them Jesus can do the same thing in their lives. And he, in his interview, said a large percentage at every one of the times that he shares received Jesus for the first time as their Lord and their Savior. He's seen miraculous healings before and after a Korn concert. Are you with me, people? This is amazing stuff. He's won his bassist to Jesus as well. He's there at his side. He's had Todd White come to the concerts before and after and pray for people's healings, and miraculous things have happened. People are coming to know Christ. Why? Because someone speaks their language, understands their pain, and is willing to have a conversation that brings Christ into that reality. It's amazing. You know how that guy came to know Christ? He had a friend that was into monster trucks. And the guy that was into monster trucks was into Jesus. He spoke the language of monster trucks. How's that as a language? Our men have thought about having a car show. You know, there's people that speak car and car show or golf or raising kids or putting up with husbands. That there's people that speak our language. And the truth of the matter is, you already speak so many languages. You don't have to go learn one. You discover yourself in a conversation where you're speaking the same language. See? Now, we want to continue those conversations. As we approach this journey to the cross thing, which is absolutely amazing. If you've ever been through it, it's an encounter with God. It's totally unexpected. People can come to that. They won't feel like they've gotten church pushed upon them. There's not even a speaker or a worship service. You just walk through a labyrinth of different stations that tell you something about Jesus and what he did for you, and you experience it in some way for yourself. From one station to the other, it's experiential. It's at your own pace. It's whatever God speaks to your heart. It'll be in English and it'll be in Spanish. And if you have a friend that you might not feel comfortable bringing to church, but you've talked to them about Jesus, ask them to come to the journey. Bring them. Go through it with them. Go through it a few paces behind them. And then afterwards, just continue the conversation. You might have a conversation that plants a seed that becomes a saved life somewhere down the line. You don't have to be the person that wins them to Christ that day. There's all places in this process of winning people closer and closer to Jesus. You might just bait their curiosity for what Jesus is, having had that experience, take them to Panera thereafter, and all you have to do is say this: what'd you think? What'd you think? You're in a spiritual conversation, folks. It's that simple. And if somewhere in that conversation you can simply get across how precious Jesus is to you, that may be the only seed you need to share. If you can get across somewhere in that conversation that, hey, you know, this God is real. And I've discovered him to be real. And I know with all my heart he would be just as real for you as he's been for me. If you ever want to talk about that, if you ever want someone to walk alongside you as you make those discoveries, man, I'm your guy. I'm your gal. We can walk this through together. And we can discover the best thing this life has to give. In this life, you can discover life eternal. And it has a name. And the name of that life is Jesus. And he can be yours. And you can be his. And folks, that is the good news that every aching heart in this world needs to hear. Because no matter what other language we have in common, we all speak human. And you'll be locking eyes with them all these. Would you let your church give you a $10 gift card to take a friend and just have a conversation? You know why we do that? Because we think that we don't have anything more powerful to invest in this whole church as a way of getting the message out than you. Than you. Because we believe what God believes, that God can use all of us, any of us, and he can use you. And it may start right now. As you hear this song sung here in just a minute about love in any language, would you think about who speaks your language and whose language do you speak? Who have you already had those kind of conversations with? And maybe as you leave here today, pick up a card. Well, what if I don't use the card? Hey, we think it's worth the risk. Take it. Take it. Use it. See what God does with it. See if you're not all of a sudden in a green room somewhere this week and you don't know why you're there until a conversation happens. Well, while you got stuck in this long line at Walmart and the cashier register person just walked away. It's been gone for 5 minutes. Have you noticed who's in front of you? Who's behind you? Can you read the signs? Can you be a sign? Jesus says yes. God bless you. Think about that who and the when of where you might be a sign over these next several weeks to invite someone to experience a little bit more of Jesus through Journey at the Cross.